generous setup. Thank you for making this happen, and to Finkelstein Memorial Library and to everybody who's here. It's a pleasure. I love having a chance to share this work. So I was just thinking a moment ago, the foundation of what I have to offer starts with a love of nature. If I were to think of a triangle, nature would be at the peak, and art and photography would be one angle, and conservation would be another. So nature, conservation, and art, finding a way to blend those in a unique way. I grew up in upstate New York, so I have something in common with Spring Valley. And one of the things I have in common is an experience of the forests around my home where I grew up, not having a giant view of oceans and big mountains, but of forests and streams. And that really got me interested in close-up nature, turning over logs and finding salamanders and looking for frogs and things like that. So I've always loved really tiny nature. And that's what this particular work grew from, is that love of the close-up. I learned to use a scanning electron microscope about 8 years ago or so. And I'm going to bring us to an example here. This actually was a blueberry seed. If you're familiar with blueberry seeds, they're extremely tiny, unbelievable texture and patterns that I found there. And those absolutely fascinated me. I made this image after several years of practice with the microscope. So I'll talk about technique a little bit about this a little bit later. I'm going to close the door here. My project is a traveling exhibition called Food for Thought, and it is about food and climate change. I believe strongly that the beauty and the awe that is food, or really anything in nature when you look closely at it, that's a doorway and an invitation to learn more and to care more about how we impact these foods and how they impact us. So I'm going to continue with a couple. This is a carrot leaf detail and a hop leaf. And just one aside story here about this one. Actually, I'm going to come back to that. I'll tell you that story in a little bit. All these images that I just showed you were featured in the February issue of National Geographic. And I was thrilled to share that and have that opportunity to put that out in the world, plus to bring the educational component of food, how it's produced, how it's impacted by climate, how it could help heal climate change challenges. And so all those issues fascinate me. National Geographic took a more conservative view with imagery, where I was working with the montage and making surreal images. They wanted just to see the real thing. So I was willing to share that with them. I said, okay, I'll do that. But I look forward to sharing with you something a little bit further along the way. That went too far. Let's see. What I want to show you here, back here, is the project that I'm presenting has been going on for several years, over 3 years at this point. It was a result of 100 trips to the scanning electron microscope, each time about 5 hours per visit. I scanned 100 plants or more, or several hundred plants and different items, and over 1,000 images have been put together to create the exhibition that I show, which, by the way, most of that is available on my website. and I'll show you that at the end, or a link to that. A scan is different than a photograph, where obviously with a camera, you're clicking a button. A scan on this screen would take a minute to complete. And I'm going to try to explain a little bit, just really briefly, how that comes about. Here you're looking at, they're called stubs, stainless steel stubs that are 1/2 inch in diameter. Each of them have a seed, or they might have pollen or part of a leaf or what have you. And that is coated with a thin layer of gold or palladium, which you can see in this situation, in this picture. By thin layer, that's really about the width of a strand of DNA. That's how little of that material you need to be able to conduct the scan and the electrons. So here's a picture of, it's called a sputter coater, and this is what covers the seed or the pollen with that gold and palladium. Placing that in the microscope, and then I'm able to use the monitor to create the contrast, to create a composition, texture, and contrast and brightness, etc., and focus. So that's extremely helpful. It's wizardry that I can't totally explain, but that I can go from that microscope into software and create imagery is really stunning. And again, this is, when I press the button to make an image, it will scan from the top of this, in this case, a flower anther, to the bottom in about a minute. This is just a joke here. Every once in a while, I get a little bit hungry here and I have to add some heavy metals to my diet. The project, about 4 years ago, I met an editor who was interested in the work that I was doing and said something about, well, how does this relate to food? And I was fascinated by the question. That hadn't occurred to me. I was looking at nature and thinking about things that are really just from wild nature, whereas food obviously is cultivated nature. And I said I should start looking at it. And that was the beginning of this project. I'm fascinated how art and science blend, and art and science and environmental commentary. And when I began, all I was seeing was climate will drive corn crop failure. Climate change threatens nutrients essential to human health. 8 foods you're about to lose because of climate change. And everything was a disaster. And that's basically how I was looking at it. What are the foods that are impacted? And what are the stories behind that? That's fascinating. And then I would take things to the lab. Many times they weren't that particularly interesting. They didn't really stand out. But when they did, when they made my jaw drop, that's when I chose them for my work. And so fascinating story, important story related to climate, and also stunning artistic quality. The further I went with this, I was able to start to read things about carbon farming. Came up one of the first things. I thought, what, are you kidding me? And no, it's as old as plants on the earth. Plants do take carbon from the atmosphere and basically sequester it for free, compared to the billions and trillions of dollars we're talking about high-tech sequestration projects now. If agriculture is done correctly, it is a net savings and a net sequestration, capturing of carbon rather than a release. And so much of our practice over thousands of years has been the opposite. And so we have the knowledge, and it absolutely exists, and it's being demonstrated over and over again around the world that we know how to work with the natural processes to impact climate in a positive way. And that's stunning information. So simple, but so powerful and empowering. As I learned more about that, I had to make art related to that, and had to find ways to just bring that out into conversation. I can go on and on about this. We'll try to keep it brief. There'll be lots of room for questions. This is a carrot leaf, something that is just a mundane, item that we might see every day. Before this project, you can ask my partner, Rana, I would see these carrots in the produce section with these long leaves and think, oh, I don't want to bag all those. I'm going to break them off and put them back in the produce section and just take the carrots. And I'm sure nobody was really happy when they found all that. But now, if they're fresh, well, now I bring them home, either compost them, or if they're fresh, they make great pesto. And this is one example of a climate story. A third of the food that is produced is wasted. So imagine all of the resources that go into producing food, all of the energy, all of the fertilizer, all the oil, everything related to it, for that just to be wasted. So when something like this is available, like it's called a secondary food. You don't buy carrots for the greens per se, but if you make pesto with them, it's a secondary food. It reduces food waste. It also has great nutritional value. And it's an example of making better use of the resources that are produced. There's a carrot leaf in the microscope. You'll notice all these boxes. Over years, I learned to make micro panoramas. So you might count 15 or 20 images, individual images here, that I knit together, stitched together to make a really large file. And that allows this to be a high-res image, which allows it to be like behind myself, something that could be 40 inches by 40 inches and be tack sharp. And then you can walk up to it and see it and kind of just get lost in the texture and the pattern and be fascinated by it. So that's a little bit about my process. Another example of carrot leaf, and this is where I went with it. I love art and science. I love fact and metaphor. So we're talking about fact, but the metaphor here. If I can, I see flames here, or I see conflict. I see like dragon flame or something. I like that being suggestive. I like that being left to a viewer, but natural forms suggest so much poetry, and they suggest so much design and fascination. By the way, carrots hate really hot weather. They bolt. Their texture is poor. They are they just aren't palatable, and that's an issue with a warming planet. And for example, Australian researchers have found that they're, in a lot of situations with a hotter agricultural circumstances, they're going to lose one of their best crops and most successful crops, or at least not have it be nearly as attractive. So I'm going in a different direction here. This is a piece of charcoal. This is a composite image of a piece of biochar, which is a kind of charcoal. This is in scale about the width of a pinhead. If you were to look closely, you see capillary crystalline structure, which has been described as a microbial hotel. Biochar is an addition to soil, which adds organic matter to soil and holds water, gives a place for microbes to live. And the reason why I give this this conversation or talk about this is soil is one of the crucial, absolutely crucial elements of healthy ecosystems, biodiversity, and believe it or not, carbon capture and climate change. So much soil, if you fly across the country, so much is left uncovered, often to bake in the sun or to erode away. And there's an estimate that up to 2% of the water in the ocean, which is enough water to fill the whole Mediterranean Sea, is water that used to be held on land, and that the land, from clearing, from erosion, from agricultural practices or deforestation, has lost the ability to hold that water. So that's a striking and stunning fact. And in answer to that, or as as something to look at, is what could we do to bring water back that can be held on land? And that has to do with planting. It has to do with cover crops. It has to do with building soil, with adding organic matter, with using compost, with tree planting, and not leaving the ground bare where it has to heat up. So this is biochar, and obviously it's got the macro and the micro. It's another thing I try to do with my images is have that dialogue between the large and the small. Here is a red clover, macro image, and taking one of the petals of that in the microscope, and that coming together. See the clover leaves, and on the left of the image is called an awn from ryegrass. Awn is a long, thin, kind of a sharp element of the flower and grass. So this one is about cover crops. And one of the principles of regenerative agriculture, which is what I'm finding to be the most valuable and powerful in terms of climate. Regenerative agriculture, one of the principles is keep the ground covered. And it's really amazing if you were to go to a field, that's got cover crops such as this, after the first crop is taken away, through the winter or in the spring or what have you, go to bare soil, go to where there's crops, the temperature, the moisture, the content of some of the planted side is a great deal cooler, sometimes by 20 degrees or more. And imagine what that does for the microorganisms and the health of the soil. There's so many different pieces to that. Lavender. If you were to look really closely at each lavender flower of this particular variety, they have these ribs. And when I saw these ribs, I just was blown away because they look like sea stars where we live. And there's also the oil capsules that you can see here of lavender oil. So this is a lavender flower up close in a stitched image. And then I put the two together. the reason that I worked with this image is lavender is a perennial. This is another concept of regenerative agriculture. If you can rely more on things that don't need to be tilled every year, the soil has a chance to age and build like a fine wine, and microorganisms, mushroom mycelial networks, organic matter, compost, things break down, and that becomes something that can hold water. And in circumstances where this is done well, with perennial, with cover cropping and things, you can have a downpour and no water leaves the land. And right next door, there's a rush of brown water going down the road. And along with that, it could be a month later where it hadn't rained, in a situation like that. And in the area where the perennials are, or where the cover crops are, there'll still be some soil moisture. So this is a kale flower from the deck of our house here. If you look really closely, you see the parts of the flower, the anthers and the pistil. And I thought, this looks fascinating. What's going on here? This is extraordinary anther of the kale flower covered with pollen. And the pistil on the right, and blending the two here. Kale is quote unquote a superfood of the last decade or so, decade and a half. And oftentimes people will say, oh, I got my organic kale and I'm all good for life here. And that raised the question. I often go to Google and say, so what's happening with kale and climate change? And one of the first articles that came up was, your organic smoothie could be killing the planet. And I thought, what's this? And the story is that organic agriculture, especially on a large scale, may depend more on diesel machinery and tillage than a conventional farm. So while it might not use the chemicals to grow the food, it might have more greenhouse gas emissions. So it was fascinating. All this, every single food has a story that if we pay attention and learn about it, then we have a chance of doing it the right way. It's like, okay, I see, yeah, that we'll run into a wall there. What can we do? We can do something a little bit different. And that fascinates me. Being educated about these things is the beginning to change. And that, I think, is a really hopeful truth. These are Arbequina olive leaves. And here is leaf surface up close. I was at the lab for hours one day. I was getting exhausted. I was like, I'm ready to go home. And then I came upon this. And hour and a half later, so I was still working without even a complaint. I was just so blown away. How is this even possible? Nobody ever told me this is a thing. These are the trichomes on the underside of the leaf. They help it preserve water. They help keep pests from entering and bacteria from entering the stomata where the gas exchanges happen. So just unbelievable, beautiful art. This is a Arbequina olive bud. And somehow, in the process of months and months of going back and forth with all the different elements, something comes up. And that's what happened here. It became a surreal figure. And I was really amused and inspired here. A few months ago, I got an email from some musicians from Japan and Australia and said, we want to make this an album cover. And we worked out a deal, and that's happening. And I haven't seen the album yet. It's in production, but Olive Man is going viral. Olives, fascinating story. They're being slammed in the Mediterranean by a virus. And it's almost like COVID. People are cutting out 1,000-year-old olive trees and trying to distance them from each other so there'll be less of a spread. There have been huge temperature spikes that have caused die-offs and poor crops in Italy over the last several years. Olives grown in California are they're having some struggles too. There are people now taking olives up to Oregon and moving north, which is common with several crops. Their ranges are shifting. My partner Rana and I love to snorkel in the Salish Sea where we live here in Washington State. You can see a type of kelp here, bull kelp, which grows about a foot or two a day in the summertime. It's phenomenal for carbon sequestration in the coastlines. Climate change has led to some wipeout of the predators of urchins. Urchins love kelp. So kelp is really getting slammed by urchins because they don't have the predators of sea otters or of sea stars. And when we snorkel, we see this kind of damage. I brought from an urchin. The urchins have these phenomenal tube feet that they attach and move with. And at the very tip, this is the very tip of an urchin's tube foot. So I use that in the imagery here. This is the bull kelp, the air bladder that helps it float on the surface, and the holdfast, which is like roots. And I put all these elements together. In a moment, we'll show you that. The blades of the kelp, and these are all the teeth marks of the urchin. So that's how that one came together. And the story again is, well, kelp is edible, urchins are edible. This is something about food, but it's also very much about climate, very much about biodiversity and about the state of our oceans. Blueberries, one of my favorite foods in the world. We try to pick about 40 pounds a year, and it's hard to keep them frozen for the year because we just want to eat them all fresh. But I love blueberries. The seed is extremely small, as I showed you earlier. There was something here that struck a nerve with me. And this image, unlike some of them that took months and months and sometimes years, this one took about 5 seconds to resolve. Yeah, Kent is nodding his head there. Yep. We've all seen William Anders's image from 1968. And when I removed the background, the white background of the blueberry, and it was black, I just said Earth, and then it was all over from there. So that's blueberries. Again, range shift, pollinators, loss of pollinators, loss of bees at certain times. All these kinds of freak weather events where there are freezes or droughts or what have you at the wrong time when something is flowering. And so, you know, berries and lots of other crops are really struggling with this kind of battering. This is a fascinating plant. It's a floating fern called azolla. And a friend of mine nearby had this, and I brought it home. I said, "What is this?" And again, I love going to search online. Azolla, 15 years ago, there was a trip to the Arctic, a research trip, and they found 15 meters of compressed azolla in the seabed, in the seafloor. And basically what the story turned out to be was half of the carbon dioxide was taken out of the atmosphere by massive lake of Azolla in the Arctic 50 million years ago. So that absolutely fascinated me, to give an element of time and millions of years to this story, climate story. Plants are extraordinarily capable of as is all of nature really, of balancing the climate. We just have to work with them. So I put these plants, put the Azolla, another batch of it in a large wine glass and photographed it from above, and then created this image. This is in the foreground. The micrographs are leaves, 2 leaves that you'll see that are green there. So the micrographs are the large, the dominant feature. Sunflower. This was about 125 images stitched together to get the texture. You can see florets amongst the seeds and the petals and things, these florets. I'll show you a detail of a floret here in a moment. Here's a petal, micrograph of a petal. There's a detail of the floret. And pollen, which is extraordinary COVID-like structure, I'm sorry to say, but beautiful, beautiful object. And that's how this one came together. Sunflowers are resilient to drought and heat and disease. They've been around for a long, long time. There's more genes in the genome I think by a factor of 2 compared to the human genome. So they have this remarkable genetic wealth that researchers are looking at to help make crops more resilient. We're getting close to wrapping up here. This is one called mushroom cloud. This is the variety of mushroom cloud that I like. I mentioned earlier the importance of soil, how crucial it is for a healthy biodiversity, but also for a cooler climate. And really healthy soil will have mycelium. That's what I have in the foreground here. That's mycelium from mushroom, which people have probably been reading about. It's this massive net and network underground that trades minerals, water, and nutrients. Healthy soil has that. Hot soil and eroded soil rarely does. The other thing that is fascinating to me is that mushrooms, like other plants as well, mushrooms release spores in the trillions, and they become rain seeds. So having healthy soil and healthy plants and healthy biodiversity and agriculture, cover crops, etc., they're called bioaerosols, things that are floating into the sky and creating rain seeds. And that is one way to bring the moisture out of the atmosphere and keep things cool in the local ecosystem. So hugely important in the whole story here. So I'm going to open up for questions here. Thank you for your interest. See more at robert-photography.com or on Instagram, same, robert-photography. I am going to leave this one up here for a screenshot. If anybody wants further information, you can look into these organizations. There's good books and films and web resources. Maria, Vanessa, I'd love to open it up to any questions here. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Robert. This was a fascinating program and presentation, and we appreciate the resources, especially the books. So we are going to open it up for Q&A now. Everyone can feel free to either unmute or drop your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll review them. I know that we do have some already there, so we can start with those. So the first question was, how is the gold or palladium applied? I think that was from the very beginning of your talk.
Right. So that sputter coater, basically by sputter, it's atomized. It is basically sprayed on after taking all of the air out of the, so you evacuate everything in this little chamber, no air there. And then there's this shot of the gold palladium, and it just sprays out like spray paint or something.
Very interesting. The next question is, can you give us an example of how agricultural practices can both yield food and sequester carbon effectively?
Absolutely. Talked about that a little bit along the way there, but silviculture is one example, and that is our agroforestry and silviculture are blending trees such as hazelnuts or fruit trees or chestnuts or something with sheep, with animals, where there is something that's not being tilled. It's perennial. You're creating, whether fruits or nuts or what have you, and you're also benefiting from the action of the animals. And the animals, I was ignorant before starting this project about how important and how crucial animals are to soil building if done correctly. Think about the 50 million bison on the prairie and the antelopes and all that was wiped out. They had this extraordinary symbiotic relationship that left fertilizer that would chew roots close to the soil, and then they would move on, and the roots would get stronger. I said chew roots, I mean chewing the grass. The roots get stronger, they put more carbon into the soil, and then they recover when the animals leave, and they come back and do that again. That's just a vision of how rich prairie soils and grassland soils can be maintained with correct animal husbandry. And I mentioned the agroforestry. That's another very productive, extremely productive way of capturing carbon and producing food. That's one of many, 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 many examples there. Look at the film Kiss the Ground. That's got lots of examples. Carbon Farming Solution has lots of examples.
Definitely will. Thank you, Robert. Another question that we have is, from your research and communications from others in the field, is eating insects something to get headlines, or is it truly the future even in developed countries such as the USA?
We have some cricket powder here, and I do believe there's a lot of benefit. It just, if you were to look at the scale of the protein produced per pound compared to the energy that goes in and the water usage, the resource usage, it's something like, it's this tiny fraction of creating protein through animal protein, or through, four-legged animal protein and large livestock. I think it's definitely got potential. It is something where it has to be done right so that the wastes aren't a problem. Also that endangered species or invasive, that these insects aren't allowed to become part of the local environment, which could be an invasive species. Fascinating example is that people are using that as protein source in pet food as well, as opposed to overfishing. Instead of using fish protein, using insect protein from insects raised on land can help save fish stocks, which is massively important for the climate.
And there's actually a comment to that question from one of our attendees. I have actually eaten crickets, not bad, considerably crunchy, ants, and other insects. This was many, many years ago in the 1970s at a store in Allentown, PA named Hess's. The owner traveled the world and returned with many treasures and various items of interest he determined to be definitely out of the ordinary. And were they? If I remember correctly, they were advertised as foods of the future. And so it turns out they very well be.
Yes. Well, isn't that something how, education and exposure can change the world, and some things take a while, and all of a sudden they're the latest rage, and we'll see how this one goes. But there's more and more research and more companies. You can get chips, for example, that are made partly with cricket powder. So cricket chips.
We'll have to check those out. Maybe next time we'll have a section of brands
There you go.
for us to look into.
Right.
So we have another question that came in. What is the range of magnification you use with the electron microscopes for this project?
So for this project, it's lower than some of the really high-tech machines. Mine, I may have gone up to a couple thousand, maybe 3,000 on a few images, but more of them are in the hundreds or lower hundreds. A carrot leaf isn't that small, so to be able to see that, I don't need to go more than, say, 100, but it's enough to show the detail. That's what I'm looking for.
Wow, that's incredible. So I think maybe we can stop recording for the last portion and open it up for anyone else that would like to.
Great.
Okay, great.